So I feel the need to confess. I couldn't remember where we ended last week. And I've asked some trusty folks, and I didn't get a real clear answer where they thought I ended either. So, so we're going to kind of take up a little bit of chapter 57, because I know I didn't finish 57, but I couldn't remember. I think maybe I'm about ready for verse 14 is kind of where I was thinking.
You just start wherever you want.
I start wherever I want, and I mean, come on, if I probably could have just started there, and y'all would have thought that's where we were supposed to be anyway, so I wouldn't have had to say anything. But so we've started this new section of Isaiah, and we did a lot of introductory stuff last week. I do remember that, and the introductory stuff kind of gave us the differences between the section we've been in versus the section we're coming to. So, you know, we concluded chapter 55, and that's that predominant theme of that section in those last few chapters had been, you know, God sends a preacher, and so we are, our God sends a servant, and now that we're getting into our new section, it's going to be the God high and holy sends a preacher. And so we're going to see kind of a contrast between the roles of the one that God is sending to deliver his people, or to bring deliverance to his people, and how God is going to interact with his people, because their situation has changed. In chapters 40 through 55, we see God interacting with his people as they are in exile, and he's preparing them for the return. And then in chapters 56 through 66, we see them in various stages of deliverance from captivity. So in just like we've talked about in some parts of Isaiah, there's a little bit of difficulty in interpreting kind of the you know, what pronouns go with what nouns, and how who is speaking at various times, or things like that. There are times in this last section that we're going to see it's kind of hard to peg a time frame that's real specific. Sometimes it sounds like he's talking to exiles that are on their return, that are kind of making the trip back. Other times it sounds like he's talking to exiles that have been there a long time, or that have been returned back in the nation for a long time, and should have achieved a certain level of success because they've been in you know, back in Jerusalem for a while. And so we'll see that from time to time as we read through. It sounds like he kind of morphs from different periods of time in different places throughout this section of Isaiah. So we're going to see God interacting with the people as they come back, or as they have come back from Babylonian captivity. So now my pages are all out of order too, by the way. A minute ago I didn't know where I was. Now I really don't know where I'm at. So I think about right there looks good. Okay. So just to kind of recap through chapter 57, where we're dealing with the subject of idolatry, which is remarkable that we've dealt with idolatry all the way through Isaiah. I mean, we were dealing with idolatry back in the early chapters of Isaiah when they were dealing with the Assyrians, and we're talking about idolatry as they're in captivity with Babylon, and now they're back from captivity, and we're still talking about idolatry. The pervasiveness of sin is a constant theme throughout the book of Isaiah, and one that we should take note of and learn from. So this first 10 verses or so of Isaiah 57, he's dealing with this theme of idolatry, and he compares them to you know, a sorceress or witchcraft. He's comparing them to adulterers, to prostitutes. It was a graphic reading as we went through this part of the first part of Isaiah chapter 57, but that's the graphic nature of sin. And so we're not surprised by the way God views sin. Hopefully we view sin the way that God views it. It turns our stomach the way it turns his stomach, and it makes us have that reaction. So he's talking about their relationship with their idols through this part, and how they're interacting with those idols, and what it means for their relationship with the Father. I remember talking about some of this stuff. So when he asked, you know, do you not fear me? That people feared the idols more than they feared God. So we kind of got through that section. I think the post-exilic community was engaged in idolatry. which was a clear rejection of God, and they worshiped the idols because they feared the idols, but they did not fear God. I think we can pick up right there with this section and start in chapter 57, verse 14. That was the problem. They were upside down. Two-sided pages would give me a problem here. Now I'm ready for that section. Okay. So 57, 14 through 21. And it will be said, build up, prepare the way, remove every obstacle out of the way of my people. For thus says the high and exalted one who lives forever, whose name is holy. I dwell on a high and holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. For I will not contend forever, nor will I always be angry, for the spirit would grow faint before me in the breath of those whom I have made. Because of the iniquity of his unjust gain, I was angry and struck him. I hid my face and was angry, and he went on turning away in the way of his heart. I have seen his ways, but I will heal him. I will lead him and restore comfort to him and to his mourners, creating the praise of the lips. Peace, peace to him who is far and to him who is near, says the Lord, and I will heal him. But the wicked are like the tossing sea, for it cannot be quiet, and its waters toss up refuse and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. So as Israel drifts away from God, his response is to draw near to them to bring them back. And I mean, if that's all we know about God, that's pretty remarkable. That as the people that he is wanting to be in relationship with are drawing away from him through their sin, his response, his initial reaction is to draw closer to them, to provide them more incentive to reciprocate, to draw close to him. And I mean, that's just a beautiful image of God. That's a beautiful picture of God. And I think there are other images that we can think of. We can think of a parent-child relationship, and if you have a child that is rebellious or that's trying to draw away, I think the parents have that same that same motivation, that same reaction to try to strengthen that relationship with the child. I see it in the lives of teachers that I teach with that are so good. Some people just have a knack for that. They have children that want to cause trouble, and teachers that can develop relationships with them and draw them into a relationship that they don't attack the behavior, they form the relationship, and the relationship helps curb the behavior. And God is doing that. He's drawing near to his people to try to provide them with a motivation to give up their sin, to give up their idolatry. Johnny.
Reminds me of the parable of the lost sheep, that one sheep.
Yeah.
The shepherd goes after it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. There's Jesus gives the illustration of the shepherd. The sheep know his name and they hear his voice and they come to him. They only do that because he has spent time with them and he has developed that relationship with them. And Jesus, as the good shepherd, is the one that is not a hireling. He's not going to abandon us at the first sign of trouble. He's going to draw near to us. And I think I won't say the chapter. I think it's Psalm 38, where God is near to the brokenhearted, and whether they're brokenhearted because of tragedy that's befallen them, or they're brokenhearted because of the results of sin, or whatever it is, when their heart is broken and it's contrite and it's open the way that it should be, then God is able to draw near, and God does not recoil from us because of our sin. Sin does separate us from God, but when we're willing to give that sin up, God doesn't view us with contempt or with disgust because we have sinned. He is willing to draw near to us. And so this is just a beautiful picture of God in this section, where his response is to draw near to his people. And think of the imagery that is used there, the way that it's explained. God offers land and he offers the holy mountain. The holy mountain we think of it as God's residence. That's where God lived. If you had to give God an address, or I used to say if you wanted to send God a postcard, you would address it to the Temple Mount. That's where he lived in the minds of the Israelite worshipers. And so God offers them land in his own neighborhood, in his own vicinity, that he's going to grant them a place to live near to him. He removes obstacles from them in this passage. He takes away the things that are keeping them from him. He seeks out those that are humble and contrite. He sends his Spirit to revive those who are weary. God offers to heal and comfort and give peace. But that passage ends with that statement, that definitive statement, the wicked will find no peace. As long as they stay in rebellion to God, as long as they continue in their idolatrous ways and refuse the advances that God makes towards them, then God will allow them to perish in their wickedness. He will allow them that lifestyle that they have chosen. And I think one thing that struck me through this whole study of Isaiah is the number of times that we see the contrast of where the people are at versus where God wants them to be. This is the life I have planned for you. This is the relationship that I call you into. But because of your sin, you're going down this path, and life is hard. You're making lots of mistakes, and you're bearing the consequences of those mistakes, and you're being punished because of the mistakes that you make. But this is the way I want it to be. I want this relationship with you where you can be blessed and you can be uplifted. But when we refuse God's way of doing things, he allows the people to go down that path that they have chosen. So that, I think, brings us kind of to the conclusion there of that section and the thoughts that are built in there. A couple of wrap-up questions to that part of the study. Communities have, the overall title or thought within these couple of chapters was the idea of inclusiveness, that God was looking to include more people into his community, and we even had that those passages about the eunuchs and the foreigners that were allowed into community with God, and he was saying that he wanted to expand his, who was going to be brought into that group. And so kind of thinking along those lines, communities generally have a tendency to trend toward exclusivity instead of inclusivity over time. As you have a group of people that form, they kind of draw closer together. As those relationships knit within that smaller group, they tend to get to the point where they don't allow new members. They don't allow new people in, because that would upset the balance. It would upset the homeostasis that we have there. It would upset the feeling of the group. And so generally groups tend to trend towards exclusivity. But here, God through Isaiah is preaching the idea of inclusivity. So is God's message of inclusivity in Isaiah applicable to our church, to the church today? Does the church today tend towards exclusivity, tend towards becoming harder for people to come to, when we should have God's view? Understand what I'm asking, that we should have God's view of what it means to become a member of this community, become a part of this community. That's a question. Yes. Okay, so is the church designed to be inclusive or exclusive?
Inclusive.
Ooh, that's a loaded question.
Actually, it's kind of both.
Because
I'm sitting here thinking it's inclusive because God includes anyone who wants.
Anybody who is willing to answer the
him,
call.
And yes.
Yes.
But yet it's exclusive because he sets the standards for how we get in.
He sets the limits for who is in and who is not. We don't get to change those limits. Just like they did in the days of Isaiah, we didn't get to just open it up and say that anybody could do any job, say within the temple or within the tabernacle or whatever they were worshiping in, because God had set the limits for who was allowed there. But did God want them to limit who could come to him? Who could seek him, who could approach him in worship? No, he didn't want them to be exclusive in that sense. And
we don't do that.
And so we shouldn't do that as well. And so is the church designed to be inclusive or exclusive? Well, somewhat both, because we don't get to set the parameters. God set those. But within the church, and certainly as we think about how we evangelize, or how we take the gospel to people, or who we teach, or who we study with, or who we invite to services, all of those kind of things. Man, if we have limits or standards that God doesn't have, that's dangerous. That's a real dangerous place for us to be as a church.
No, Jason, it's one of those things that God's in control. He's the one that adds to the person.
Right. God adds to the church. Good.
And we can't take away from that.
Right.
And we have to be accepting of that when it comes that time. When someone obeys the gospel, we need to be there to encourage them.
Yeah.
And if they get lost, we need to go after them as much as we possibly can to bring them back.
Right. Yeah. And so I know that, I mean, just sitting up here and saying the word inclusive and exclusive, I mean, that in today's climate, in today's political world, that, I'm surprised some of you haven't thrown rocks at me already, but
Nobody here.
but it's just, those are charged words in our society today. Those have a definite
Connotation.
set of connotations that are sometimes difficult to overcome. But thinking about it in terms of God's view of his kingdom and God's desire for that to be as inclusive as it can possibly be. God is calling the poor, he is calling the sick, he is calling the hurting, he is calling the rich, he's calling the famous, he's calling everybody. And we want anybody who will to answer that call. And we shouldn't have parameters or exclusions in mind that there are people that we're not going to allow into our fellowship. Teresa.
Never underestimate the power of the blood of Jesus.
The power of,
The blood of Jesus.
right, yeah, that's exactly right. We cannot underestimate the power of the blood of Christ to change lives. Greg.
You know, the problem is that the church as it existed then in many ways today, they had a way of being exclusive in what they considered holy. And as we go through Isaiah here, especially in 58, we'll see what God considers holy.
Right, yes.
And those are to be included. You know, and he's talking about people that they excluded that needed to be included, need to be loved, need to be provided for.
Right.
And so when Jesus says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden," you know, he's talking about everyone that has a burden.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right. There is holiness is the bar that God has set. It's the standard that God has set. And so, when we're talking about inclusive and exclusive views of the church, you know, even Paul, when he wrote first letter of 1 Corinthians to the church there, they were tolerating things that they should not have been tolerating when it came to immorality, and that while they would say, yeah, but we're being inclusive, we're including people, we're trying to allow people to worship or whatever, and Paul said, well, those things should not be allowed within the body. We should keep those things out because they are unholy, they are unrighteous. And we're going to see that in chapter 58 as well as we move into the next chapter, that God does not allow unrighteousness in his worship.
Well, it's about the purity.
Right, purity, holiness, absolutely. So another thing that was addressed in this section was problems in leadership. What were the problems of leadership in post-exilic Israel? And do our leaders today face the same challenges? I don't remember what the problems of leadership were from last week. It's back in chapter 57. Let me find that heading. I don't think I even have the right notes. Or chapter 56 is what last week would have been. We just finished 57.
Chapter 57, the first few verses, the first verse, the righteous man perishes and no man takes it to heart. Does that have something to do?
Say that again.
The first verse of chapter 57. The righteous man perishes and no man takes it to heart.
The righteous perish and no man takes it to heart.
The devout men are taken away now.
Verse 11 and 12 of 56.
There you go. The dogs are greedy and they are not satisfied, and they are shepherds who have no understanding. They have all turned to their own way, each one to his unjust gain. To the last one, come, they say, let us get wine and let us drink heavily of the strong drink, and tomorrow will be like today, only more so. Which I thought was a funny way of saying, we'll get drunk and party at their expense today, and tomorrow we'll get even drunker and party harder at their expense. Tomorrow will be even more so. We'll get even richer at their expense tomorrow. So the trappings of leadership that they were giving into there was just the idea of enriching themselves on the backs of the people that they're supposed to be leading. And now I remember, addressing that last week, talking in terms of, we saw that in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel has an entire chapter, I think it's like chapter 30 or 33 of Ezekiel or something like that, where he talks about the leaders of Israel and the shepherds, and they had done such a poor job of shepherding that God was going to send his shepherd to take up the slack and to shepherd his people. But he talked about them, they were supposed to be shepherds protecting the flock, but instead they were fattening themselves by eating the flock. And that is not what they should have been doing. Teresa?
So the first verse of 57 is a result of that.
Right, yeah, so it leads right into that thought, the righteous man perishes and no man takes it to heart. So the leaders who were supposed to be protecting the righteous were sacrificing the righteous. And so, that's, I think all of this stuff is appropriate mind exercises for us to go through and to think about as we think about the modern things that we face. Just because we live in a modern era doesn't mean that our leaders today don't face these same things. And so the examples that we see here can serve as examples for anybody in any leadership position today. Johnny?
I mean, we see so many of these tele-preacher type folks that just, they're making, I read a headline the other day, I didn't even read the story, of how many multi-millionaires we have as religious leaders in the world. And,
right.
They just suck it out. And I realize this shows my age, but one of the first ones was Jim Baker way back when, who got himself on TV and just sucked millions of dollars out of people.
PTL.
And they just, people see them as their gods and not as just men. And then when they fall, it's just, they lose what faith they had, but they didn't have faith in the right thing.
Yeah, and that's, and I think we see that again throughout the examples that we have in Scripture of those leaders who do that and betray the ones that they're supposed to be leading to that degree, face a measure of judgment from God that is scary to comprehend. And they face a much stiffer judgment, because not only have they condemned themselves, they have condemned others through their actions. Tim?
That's a millstone tied around your neck.
Oh, it's yeah. It makes me, the Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley with the chains. Every link of the chain was somebody that he had trodden underfoot, and I think that's an appropriate mental image of the way God views the leaders that would abuse their leadership positions. Scary thing. Should make you appreciate good leaders. Because they have taken on that responsibility and are doing it faithfully. So for this week, you should read Isaiah 58 and 59. That was the end of last week. So here we go. We're ready for this week now. Isaiah 58 and 59. We're going to talk about horizontal and vertical dimensions. Makes me feel like a math teacher. I like it. So here's where we're at. The student can explain that how Israel treated others affected how God responded to their worship. Think about that for a second. Their worship was affected, or how God viewed their worship was affected by the way they treated other people. And we should also be able to share that how Israel treated others affected how God forgave sin. And so we see that example as well in the New Testament. Those that are unwilling to forgive God is unwilling to forgive them. So we know that the way that we interact with other people does affect our own ability to receive forgiveness from God. So I had built in here a little, we kind of already done this review. What were the sins that were being committed in chapters 56 and 57? Well, we had idolatry. We had failures in leadership, were the two big ones. And then he kind of asked an interesting question. What is sin? Lest we forget.
Disobedience.
Disobedience, okay.
It's an offense against God.
An offense against God. Okay? The word, 1 John, in 1 John it says sin is lawlessness. It's a breaking of God's law. And the word sin itself is a word from the world of archery where it means missing the mark. You aim for the bullseye and you miss it. And sometimes, you know, the way we act, sometimes I wonder if we were even aiming for the bullseye. But we certainly miss the bullseye very often. Tim?
Ultimately, it's separation.
The result of sin is absolutely separation. It's separation from God. And we'll see that tonight. We'll see that in chapter 59. So part of tonight's reading anyway, but we'll see if we get there. So that's the quick review. We've kind of already talked a lot about those things tonight. So background for chapters 58 and 59, some things to think about as we begin reading that text and thinking about the themes that we'll find in chapters 58 and 59. So there are two broad biblical doctrines that stand in the background of these two chapters. And the first theme or the first doctrine that we'll look at is worship, and we'll see that in chapter 58. So beginning with the Ten Commandments, biblical teaching connects how individuals treat one another, that's the horizontal dimension, with how one relates to God in worship, that's the vertical dimension. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about those two different dimensions. Our horizontal is how we treat one another in our community, in our relationships, and that vertical dimension is how we interact with God, or how God views the things that we are attempting to do in his name. So, you know, that starts all the way back with the 10, and I think probably even before the 10 Commandments, because if you go all the way back to Cain and Abel, God confronts Cain and says, you know, where's your brother? and Abel, you know, Abel was gone, he was dead, and Cain was abandoned and was driven out and all that, and it affected his relationship with God because he because he murdered his brother. So in that heading then of worship, the idea of how we interact with one another affecting the way that God views our worship or the way that we're able to worship, let's look at a couple of passages. And we can start in Isaiah chapter 1. So all the way back at the very beginning of Isaiah, we have Isaiah introducing this topic all the way back in chapter 1, and interesting that he's still dealing with it with the remnant that has returned from Babylonian captivity, which really is like 200 years after he's writing. So he writes chapter 1 to his contemporary Israelites, and he's writing the later chapters to a much future generation, and he's still writing about the same thing. Chapter 1, verses 10 through 17, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ears to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams, the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure the iniquity and the solemn assembly. I hate your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. So when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Wow, that is a diatribe that God pronounces there against the people, saying how he rejects their worship. Any form of worship that they can imagine that they want to offer to God, God says, I reject it. I hate it. I don't want it. I have not asked you to do these things. I don't want to hear from you. What I want you to do first, he says there at the end, instead of offering up this worship that is meaningless to me because of the way you're living, go fix these things first. Fix the way, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil, cease to do the evil, do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. It's our relationships with one another that stand as a foundation for worship. And if we're not interacting the way we should with one another, then God views our worship as worse than disgusting. It's an abomination to him because we're not doing what we should be doing in our relationship with one another. So the horizontal has that effect on the vertical. And it should be an eye-opening passage for us. It should be something that makes us think. We see it also in Amos, chapter 5, verses 21 to 24. He says, I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, and I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Take care of justice and righteousness first, and then let's talk about your worship. But until you've taken care of justice and righteousness, I'm not interested in your worship. It's meaningless to me. It's worse than meaningless. It's offensive. And so, again, that is an eye-opening passage for us to consider as we think about how we interact with others and how that affects our worship. So 1 John chapter 4, this is one we've looked at even recently in our Sunday morning series. 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has not seen cannot love God whom he has seen, cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. And so he makes the point in the notes that if we think of worship as being a representation of our love for God, I mean, that's in essence what worship is. In fact, the word worship itself is a word that means to kiss toward. It's like a kissing of the hand and blowing somebody kisses. And so when we think of what worship is, it's blowing kisses of love to God. And he says, if you're not going to take care of other people, if you're not going to love the people in your life, why would I care about you expressing love to me? And so that's a stark reminder as well. Teresa?
I know there's a lot of them, but I always go back to the one in Matthew, chapter 5, verses 23 and 24.
Yeah.
You know, it says, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and you're there, and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go, first be reconciled to your brother,
Yep.
and then come and present your offering.
Yeah.
So I know there's more, but I always go back to that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's representative of how our relationships with one another impact our ability to have a relationship with God. We can't worship him properly if we are locked into improper relationships with one another. That's where we're at. And that's going to be the central theme of Isaiah chapter 58. Okay, so that's where we're headed into with Isaiah 58. Isaiah 59 is going to bring up the second important biblical doctrine. The first one was worship. The second one is forgiveness. So here we see that the biblical story centers on the occasions when God forgives human sin, which that's the vertical dimension, and yet also demands that humans live in communities marked by good relationships, and that's the horizontal dimension. And so God is willing to forgive, but there's something that goes along with that. God doesn't just pour out forgiveness willy-nilly. He ties it to something. And we see that in the parable that Jesus tells about the unforgiving steward. We see that in the Lord's Prayer, forgive me my trespasses, I forgive those who trespass against me. We see it throughout the New Testament and here in the Old Testament as well, that God ties forgiveness for his people to the way his people live in various forms, in various ways. Okay? Isaiah, same heading here, Isaiah 1 through 12. God seeks to maintain fellowship with 8th century Jerusalem, but they continue to oppress the weak and vulnerable. If you go back and rewatch some of those lessons that we did in those first 8 chapters, you see that theme over and over again, that their oppression of the weak and the vulnerable was the thing that God kept coming back to, that they were oppressing the widows and the orphans, that they were neglecting the foreigners in their land, that they were mistreating the people that were not able to care for themselves. And God demands that the relationships in the community be righted before he grants forgiveness. if you're not willing to do the right thing, I'm not going to pour out my forgiveness on you so that you can continue doing the wrong thing. If you know, I mean, that's just the way it is. And so we'll see, getting into it here, that Isaiah 58 takes up the horizontal and vertical dimensions of worship, while Isaiah 59 takes up the horizontal and vertical dimensions of forgiveness. Johnny?
We have so many people that believe that God is love, and it doesn't matter what I do.
Yeah.
God has always had a dimension that you have to do what He wants you to do
Yeah.
before He blesses you. Always.
Yeah. And I agree. I mean, God has expectations. God has standards. He has limits to what He will endure and won't endure. And He makes those expectations clear to us. And if we're not willing to do things His way, then, you know, we don't get to be God. We don't get to decide how we're going to live and call it good enough. God sets the standards. And so God calls us into holiness. He calls us into righteousness. He calls us to justice, all those things. And I mean, we can either do it His way or we can stay outside of the assembly. We can stay outside of the fellowship. So, I mean, that's kind of the way He delivers it to us. Okay. Isaiah 58. 15 minutes left, and we're starting the chapter I wanted to start tonight. All right. There we go. 58 verses 1 through 7. Cry loudly, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet and declare to my people their transgression, and to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways, as a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God. They ask me for just decisions. They delight in the nearness of God. Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice? Behold, on the day of your fast you find your desire and drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast for contention and strife and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Is it a bowing one's head like a reed, and for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into the house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. So here, lots of things going on in this opening passage of Isaiah 58. God here trumpets the sins of the people. He says his voice is like a trumpet, and he is just broadcasting their sin. And the results of that is that he rejects their worship because of the oppression of the people that they have oppressed. Because they are declaring themselves that they're fasting, and yet on the day of their fast they beat their workers to make them work harder. And they've not fed the hungry, and they've not taken care of the homeless, and they've not covered the naked, and all of these things that he brings out in that passage. They haven't done any of those things, and yet they're offering worship, and they don't understand why God is rejecting their worship. God rejects it because of their sin. And he enumerates their sins here. He lists their sins. He says it's because of these sins of oppression that God is rejecting their worship. So God declares that those who worship him must treat others in righteousness. They must treat others with justice and righteousness in order for God to accept their worship. And yet they had the gall to ask God, why are you not treating us righteously? Why are you shutting us out? Why are you cutting us off? Why are you not accepting our worship? And so they were blaming God. They were accusing God of doing the very thing that they were doing, which is shutting out those that were less fortunate. And so I don't know, is it blindness that causes people to do that? Is it arrogance? Is it hubris? What is their excuse when God calls them on this? How do they respond?
Selfishness.
Selfishness?
All sin really boils down
Yeah.
to selfishness.
Yeah, I mean, sin is selfishness. It's arrogance, it's pride, it's hubris in some degree. So they're just thinking only of themselves and not thinking of others. So God, in this section, identifies their unrighteousness. He enumerates these things. This is the thing. This is what he broadcasts like the blowing of a trumpet. They seek their own pleasure. They oppress workers. They quarrel and they fight with violence. They bind people with their wickedness. They think of like indentured servitude or something like that, where they are tricking people basically into working for them and offering them the hope of a better life, but then in the end, they oppress them to the point that they can't ever get out of that service to them. So they are hoping that they can come to work for this man, and they get they're able to earn their freedom, but then eventually he just has them so indebted to him that they can't ever get out of his service. So they're binding people with their wickedness. They put people under the yoke of oppression. They do not share with the hungry or the homeless, and they do not clothe the naked or care even for their family. And so they have even their own family members who are oppressed, and they are sharing in the oppression of their own families. So because of this, because of all of these things, God has rejected their worship. He is not going to listen to what they have to say and worship to him. That's an opening salvo that God kind of launches to them there as they're thinking about their relationship with God and their relationship with one another. So, justice and righteousness is a common theme that we see really throughout all of Isaiah. In the early chapters we saw it, but we're really going to see it in these final chapters. This section of Isaiah is going to be pretty obvious how often we're going to see justice and righteousness being a central theme. Those that were complaining, they went through the motions. They fasted, they were worshiping, they were sacrificing, but they weren't. But those things were not accepted. Do you think there's any possibility that we fall into that same trap today?
I'm sorry, what did you just say?
What's that? I mean, I think it, Johnny?
We have those that come and fill a pew. They don't live a Christian life when they leave the pew.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else follows the North Colony Church of Christ on Facebook ever. And then, because he'll post, Brother Willie will post his lessons and stuff, and then he has anyway. And I was watching something from him not that long ago about calling a brother or a sister out for the sin. You knew where I was last night.
Yeah.
You knew what I was doing last night, and now I'm here with you today, and you're not calling me out on it. And in a way, I can't remember everything he said about it, but the responsibility is ours if and I'm not trying to put her on the spot, but if Sister Brenda knows that I've done something that if she, it calls me on, and she has the heart to say, Teresa, I know you did this last night.
Yeah,
Whatever.
I think you're right, and you're onto something there, and I think that's one of the the indictments that we've seen against the leadership of Israel. In some ways, the leadership was leading them into their transgressions, but in other ways, it's just as bad that when the people were going into their transgressions that they didn't call them out of leadership. Remember Aaron at Mount Sinai when Moses was up on the mountain, and Moses comes down the mountain and the people are reveling and there's a golden calf, and he says, Aaron, what's going on? And Aaron's like, I didn't do anything. I threw it in, and out came the calf. Look what the people are doing. Even if that was true, which it wasn't, but even if that was true, Aaron, you're still guilty because you didn't stop them. It was your job as their leader to make sure that they didn't do that kind of stuff, and you let them do it. Now, he was lying. He had a part in it, and he was complicit in it. But yeah, our leaders, people need to call us out of sin, and we need to. That's hard to do. That's hard to do, Johnny.
And it's for each
I
of them.
remember Eli was told by the people what his sons were doing at the temple.
Right.
And he just ignored it.
Yep.
And he was punished for it.
Yeah, he fell off the chair and broke his neck. And so that's exactly right. We have that admonishment in Galatians chapter 6, brethren, even if a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a man in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. So we are commanded to call people out of sin.
We are each other's keepers.
Yeah, I mean, we are a community. We are, if we're not looking out for one another and calling people to holiness and righteousness, then what are we doing here? That's our job. We are to call one another to the right relationship with God. So, because ultimately I want to spend eternity with God, and in this life I want to be able to worship God. And the sins, the lack of following God's law would keep us from being able to do either of those things. And so we need to be righteous as best we can. We need to pursue righteousness. Okay, Chuck, come on, man. So now I don't even want to start the next section. Somebody write this down. Where are we at? Verse 8 is where we'll start next week. Wrapping up, I've got to do a better job of color coding notes or something too, because man, things get all out of whack here. 6, page 5, page 6. There we are. Let's see. God rejected their worship. Righteousness. Let's could define those words real quick. I guess justice means that the community works to make sure each person is treated fairly, but instead the vulnerable found peace only in death. Isaiah 57:1, and many were without the basic necessities of life. We see that in those last couple of verses that we just read here. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. The last couple of verses there: divide the bread with the hungry, the homeless had no, they were homeless, they were naked, they were hungry, there were people that were yoked. So that was not just. It was not just that some people had it easy and other people were struggling, and those that had the resources were not helping. Righteousness means that each person treated the other the way they wanted to be treated. It's like he defines righteousness in terms of the golden rule. So instead, those who complain to God are treating others in Jerusalem as lesser citizens. You don't have as much as me, therefore you are worth less than I am. Great.
It's really interesting that we have a new covenant, but we have the same God.
Yes.
Doesn't this just remind you of Matthew 25?
Absolutely.
Separating the sheep from the goats.
Absolutely. It 100%. It reminds us of exactly, the command that Jesus gave to love one another is from Leviticus. It's the same command. Jesus came and showed us how to do it. Therefore, it was his he is the fulfillment of that command. And so he shows us a new commandment because he showed us properly how to do it, because it's never been done properly. But it's the same command, to love your neighbor as yourself, to love one another. And so God calls us to the same things under our new covenant that he called us to under the old covenant. He just provides, under the new covenant, he provides a way to deal with our failures and our sins that was not available to them under the old covenant. So we have the blood of Christ to redeem us.
He gave us an example through Jesus. Before we didn't have that example, Jesus came down here and gave us the example of how to live, showed us that we could do it if we wanted to.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Isaiah talks about the servant. He talks about the preacher. He talks about the one that's going to come and fulfill righteousness and do these things in this way. But it's one thing to kind of have a mental exercise of the one who can do it properly. It's another for God to send his son and show us that he did it properly. And so as good as Isaiah is, Jesus is better. And as good as the picture that Isaiah paints is, and as accurate as it is, it's not perfect until we find it perfect in Jesus. So, okay, well, thank you for your attention. And 58:8 is where we're starting next week.